The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the picturesque town of Maplewood. Among the bustling streets lined with blooming flowers and quaint little cafes, two lives were about to intertwine in ways neither could predict. Harold Taylor, a charismatic political science professor at the local university, was known for his sharp intellect and charming demeanor. He was a man of principles, passionate about justice and equality, often advocating for the rights of marginalized groups. His lectures captivated students, and his colleagues admired his dedication. However, despite his public persona, Harold was a man with hidden insecurities, particularly in his personal life. On the other side of town, Margaret O'Brien was a well-respected high school basketball coach. Her tough exterior on the court belied a more vulnerable side, a complexity that only a few close friends were privy to. Margaret had dedicated her life to empowering young women through sports, instilling in them the values of teamwork and resilience. Her players admired her, not just for her coaching skills but for the way she inspired them to push beyond their limits. Yet, despite her accomplishments, Margaret carried the weight of a secret that she had carefully concealed from those around her. The two met during a charity event hosted by the university, a gala meant to raise funds for underprivileged children. Harold was immediately drawn to Margaret's infectious laughter and her ability to command attention without even trying. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. It was as if they had known each other for years, and soon, they were inseparable. Friends described their relationship as electric, filled with passion and excitement. They planned dates that included hiking through the nearby mountains, cozy evenings filled with laughter, and deep conversations under starlit skies. However, as their romance blossomed, Margaret began to retreat into herself, especially when discussions turned to her past. She often deflected questions about her childhood, her family, and especially the photographs that Harold wanted to see. "You don't need to worry about that," she would say with a reassuring smile, brushing off the subject. Harold, smitten by her charm, overlooked these red flags, believing that everyone has a right to privacy. He admired her strength, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Margaret than met the eye. As the months passed, Harold's friends began to notice the changes in him. He was happier, more engaged, and seemed to be planning a future with Margaret. They frequently discussed marriage, dreaming of a life filled with love and shared goals. Harold envisioned a wedding that would not only celebrate their love but also showcase their commitment to each other. Meanwhile, Margaret, while excited, felt the anxiety of her secret looming over her like a dark cloud. She loved Harold deeply, yet the fear of rejection gnawed at her insides. The couple decided to announce their engagement during a surprise dinner with friends. Harold, bursting with pride, raised his glass and shared their news. The cheers that erupted around the table filled Margaret with joy, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of apprehension. How would Harold react if he knew the truth? As days turned into weeks, the wedding preparations became more consuming. They meticulously planned every detail, from the venue to the guest list, yet Margaret felt increasingly detached from the excitement. Finally, the day arrived. June 29, 2016, dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a wedding. Friends and family gathered at St. Michael's Church, its elegant architecture providing a beautiful backdrop for the ceremony. The air was thick with anticipation and love, as guests took their seats, chatting animatedly about the couple they adored. Harold stood at the altar, beaming with happiness, his heart racing as he awaited his bride. Margaret, in her stunning gown, was radiant as she walked down the aisle, a vision of beauty and grace. Yet, behind her smile, a storm brewed. As she approached Harold, memories of her past flashed through her mind, intertwining with the hope for their future. She wanted to share her life with him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her secret would one day unravel everything they had built together. The ceremony began, filled with laughter and love, and for a moment, Margaret allowed herself to believe that she could leave her past behind. But beneath the surface, tensions were rising. Harold, who had always prided himself on honesty, felt an unsettling sense of discontent. He couldn't shake the feeling that there were parts of Margaret's life that she had yet to share with him. As they exchanged vows, he caught a fleeting glimpse of doubt in her eyes. Would she ever open up to him completely? Would their love withstand the burdens of the past? As they sealed their vows with a kiss, a sense of foreboding hung in the air, hinting at the tragic events that were about to unfold. Little did they know that their wedding day would be marked not by joy, but by a revelation that would shatter their lives forever. Margaret's secret was a ticking time bomb, and as the festivities moved to the reception hall, it was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down, changing everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and identity. The reception hall was a vision of romance and celebration. Strings of fairy lights twinkled above, casting a soft glow on the faces of friends and family gathered to honor Harold and Margaret. Laughter mingled with the sweet sound of music as guests toasted to the newlyweds, showering them with love and well wishes. The atmosphere was filled with an infectious joy, each moment punctuated by cheers and clinking glasses. Harold and Margaret, surrounded by their loved ones, danced the night away, blissfully lost in each other's eyes. As the evening progressed, Harold, buoyed by the euphoria of the day, took the microphone, his heart swelling with pride and happiness. He looked out at the crowd, his friends and family, the people who had come to celebrate their love. With a wide grin, he began to share anecdotes about their relationship, each story drawing laughter and affection from the guests. He spoke of Margaret's passion for coaching, her fierce determination, and how she had inspired him in countless ways. But amidst the laughter, a darker thought lurked at the back of his mind, a lingering doubt that he could no longer suppress. Suddenly, fueled by a mix of emotions and perhaps too much champagne, Harold decided to make a shocking revelation. He cleared his throat, an unsettling shift in his demeanor that caught the attention of the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying an edge, "I want to share something important about my beautiful bride." The crowd quieted, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Margaret's heart raced, sensing that the moment was veering into dangerous territory. With a derisive smirk, Harold continued, "Margaret isn't just a remarkable woman, she's also transgender. She's been hiding this from me, from all of you." The words cut through the atmosphere like a knife, silence enveloping the hall as shock washed over the guests. Margaret's face fell, her heart pounding in her chest as humiliation flooded her senses. The laughter that had filled the air moments before was replaced by gasps and whispers, a tidal wave of disbelief cascading through the crowd. Harold's choice of words was cruel, dripping with contempt as he recounted their early days together, accusing her of deception and manipulating him into a relationship built on lies. "She never showed me who she really was," he exclaimed, the bitterness in his tone palpable. The humiliation was excruciating, and Margaret felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her. She had always feared this moment, the possibility that her past would overshadow the love they had built. Now, it was happening in the most public of ways, and she felt utterly exposed. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she caught sight of the horrified expressions on her friends' faces. Margaret's mother, Amelia O'Brien, stood frozen in disbelief, her heart aching for her daughter. She had always warned Margaret of the dangers of revealing her true self, fearing the judgment and discrimination that could come from society. But this was not the way it was supposed to happen. This was supposed to be a celebration, a day filled with love, not a platform for public humiliation. Margaret turned on her heels, her heart racing as she fled the reception hall. She didn't stop to gather her things, she simply needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere. The laughter and music faded into a distant echo as she burst through the doors, the cool evening air hitting her like a wave. Outside, the night sky was dotted with stars, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. She felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and profound sadness as she walked away from the only man she had ever truly loved. Meanwhile, inside the hall, confusion and shock rippled through the guests. Whispers grew louder as they tried to comprehend what had just transpired. Harold, realizing the impact of his words, was met with a mix of support and disapproval. Some guests were outraged, others unsure of how to react. Among them was Kimberly Evans, Harold's adoptive sister, who had harbored her suspicions about Margaret's identity long before the wedding. She watched from the sidelines, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes as she saw the chaos unfold. As the evening wore on, Harold's bravado began to wane. He had intended to expose Margaret's secret, but he hadn't anticipated the fallout. Guests approached him, questioning his actions, some expressing concern for Margaret. Harold's anger shifted to defensiveness. He had only wanted the truth to be known, to free himself from what he perceived as a deception. But now, he felt trapped in the very chaos he had created, the realization of his actions weighing heavily on him. Margaret found herself wandering the quiet streets, the tears flowing freely as she struggled to comprehend the events that had transpired. Her thoughts spiraled into a dark abyss as she grappled with her feelings of betrayal. She had never intended to hide her past from Harold. She had simply wanted to protect herself from the discrimination and hatred that often accompanied her identity. The love they shared felt tainted now, marred by the public exposure of her most vulnerable self. Hours passed as she walked, aimlessly seeking solace in the stillness of the night. She felt utterly alone, a profound sense of loss settling over her. The wedding that had promised a future filled with love and acceptance had transformed into a nightmare. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Margaret made her way back to the church, the place where her dreams had turned into a harrowing reality. Inside, the reception had dissolved into chaos. Guests were leaving, some still in shock, others visibly upset by the events. Margaret's heart raced as she stepped through the door, hoping to confront Harold, to seek answers to the whirlwind of emotions that had engulfed her. But as she entered, she saw him slumped against the wall in the church's restroom, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. "Harold," she called out, her voice trembling with emotion. He looked up, the hardness in his eyes softening for just a moment. But the tension between them was palpable, a chasm that had formed in an instant, one that seemed insurmountable. Before Margaret could reach him, a loud bang echoed through the hall, followed by another, and another. The sounds reverberated in her mind, drowning out her cries as she stumbled backward in shock. Chaos erupted as guests screamed and scrambled for the exits, the joyous occasion shattered into fragments of fear and confusion. The world around her blurred into a cacophony of noise, the reality of the situation hitting her with the force of a freight train. Amidst the chaos, Harold fell to the ground, his body collapsing against the cold tile floor, the bright crimson of blood contrasting starkly against the white walls. Panic swept through Margaret as she rushed to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. "Harold!" "No!" she screamed, her voice choked with desperation. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in as she knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. Harold's breaths were shallow, his face pale, and the warmth of life was quickly fading. As she looked into his eyes, she could see the pain and confusion etched on his features. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, a flicker of regret flashing across his face. Those were the last words she would ever hear from him. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Margaret's world spiraled into chaos as sirens blared in the distance, approaching rapidly. She could hardly comprehend the gravity of the situation unfolding around her. The horror of the wedding day had escalated into something unimaginable, a tragedy that would forever change the course of their lives. As the flashing lights illuminated the scene, Margaret felt a growing sense of dread. The joyous celebration that had begun just hours ago had turned into a nightmare, a horrific crime scene filled with unanswered questions. In the blink of an eye, everything had unraveled, and the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders as she faced the aftermath of a love that had taken a dark and tragic turn. The flashing lights of the police cars cast a stark glow over the scene, illuminating the chaos that had unfolded within the church. Emergency responders rushed in, pushing through the crowd of terrified guests who had gathered outside, their faces pale and shocked. The air was thick with confusion and fear as onlookers whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had just occurred. Sirens wailed in the distance, drowning out the frantic murmurs of the crowd, and Margaret could feel the weight of their stares, 1,000 questions hanging unspoken in the air. As the first responders assessed Harold's condition, Margaret felt frozen in place, her mind racing as she grappled with the horror of what had happened. The warmth of Harold's blood seeped through her fingers, a reminder of the fragility of life and love. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices a flurry of commands and urgency, but to Margaret, everything felt like a surreal nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. "Stay with us, Harold. Please," she cried, her voice breaking as she squeezed his hand, desperately willing him to fight through the pain. But deep down, a creeping dread gnawed at her insides, a terrible sense of foreboding that whispered the truth she feared to acknowledge. The paramedics' expressions were grave, and when they finally stepped back, Margaret knew. "Time of death, 11:23 p.m., one of the medics announced to the gathering crowd, and in that moment, Margaret's world shattered into irreparable fragments. She cradled Harold's lifeless body, the love of her life now gone, taken from her in an instant. The whirlwind of emotions crashing over her felt insurmountable, but soon the harsh reality of the situation began to seep into her consciousness. Detective Marcus Tremblay arrived on the scene shortly thereafter, his presence commanding and composed amidst the chaos. He surveyed the room, his experienced eyes taking in every detail, the overturned chairs, the scattered decorations, the look of horror etched on the faces of the guests. He could feel the tension in the air, a palpable unease that hinted at the darker undercurrents at play. As he approached Margaret, who was still kneeling beside Harold, he noticed her tear-streaked face, her eyes filled with disbelief and anguish. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the scene," he instructed gently, but firmly. "We need to secure the area and begin our investigation." Margaret nodded absently, her mind still reeling from the shock. Once Margaret was moved away, Detective Tremblay began to gather information, interviewing guests one by one. The chaotic atmosphere gradually began to settle into a more controlled environment, but the horror of the evening lingered like a heavy fog. As he spoke with witnesses, a disturbing picture began to emerge. One guest, a close friend of Harold's, recounted the events leading up to the shooting. "Harold was angry," he explained, his voice trembling. "He was livid about something, but we didn't know what. Then, during his speech, he just exploded. It was so sudden, and we didn't see it coming." The friend's expression was one of confusion and fear, echoing the sentiments of many present that night. Detective Tremblay listened intently, piecing together the narrative that had led to this tragic outcome. He noted the underlying tension in the room, the mix of shock and disbelief among the guests. As he spoke to each person, one name kept surfacing: Margaret O'Brien. Harold's public disclosure had shocked everyone, but it was the subsequent confrontation that seemed to have escalated into violence. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Tremblay focused on the timeline of events leading to Harold's death. Witnesses described Margaret's hurried exit from the reception after Harold's shocking revelation, the palpable humiliation evident in her demeanor. It was a clear indication of the emotional turmoil she had experienced, but could it also be a motive for violence? Tremblay found himself grappling with this question as he continued to gather information. Amelia O'Brien, Margaret's mother, was one of the first family members to arrive at the scene after being notified of the tragedy. Her face was a mask of concern and disbelief as she rushed to her daughter's side. "Margaret," she exclaimed, enveloping her in a tight embrace. The two women clung to each other, both overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. Amelia, having advised her daughter to keep her identity secret to avoid such painful disclosures, felt a surge of guilt wash over her. "Mom, I didn't do anything. I swear." Margaret sobbed, the weight of the accusation hanging heavily between them. Amelia looked into her daughter's eyes, searching for the truth, but the fear and confusion clouded her judgment. "We need to talk to the police, sweetheart. They're going to ask questions," she said gently, knowing that the coming days would be filled with scrutiny and heartbreak. Meanwhile, the detectives uncovered details that added layers to the investigation. It emerged that Harold had been having an affair with his adoptive sister, Kimberly Evans. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, complicating the dynamics of the case. Kimberly had been suspicious of Margaret from the start, voicing her concerns to Harold on several occasions. Detective Tremblay sensed that Kimberly's involvement could have played a significant role in the events that had transpired. As the night wore on, the police began to piece together the sequence of events. Harold's body was taken for an autopsy, and forensic teams combed the church for evidence. Detective Tremblay collected statements from the remaining guests, piecing together a timeline of the evening's events. He learned of the tension that had been brewing, of Harold's public humiliation of Margaret, and of the emotional fallout that had followed. Days passed, and as the investigation progressed, the media caught wind of the story, sensationalizing the events that had unfolded. Headlines screamed of betrayal, secrets, and murder. The small town of Maplewood was thrust into the national spotlight, and the focus shifted to the couple at the center of this tragic narrative. Margaret, now a prime suspect, found herself thrust into a world of scrutiny and judgment, her past overshadowing her present. As Margaret waited for news of the investigation, she reflected on the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed her life. The love she had for Harold had been genuine, but the pain of his betrayal cut deep. She couldn't understand how the man she had promised to spend her life with had turned on her so cruelly. The memories of their laughter, the dreams they had shared, felt like echoes of a life that no longer existed. When the police finally announced Margaret's arrest, the weight of the moment felt suffocating. Detective Tremblay stood before a group of reporters, outlining the evidence against her: Harold's public humiliation, her hasty departure from the scene, and the lack of a solid alibi. To the outside world, it seemed like a straightforward case, but for Margaret, it was a nightmare from which she could not awaken. As she sat in her cell, the reality of her situation settled in. She was not just a suspect, she was a woman whose life had been irrevocably changed in the blink of an eye. The weight of her identity, her past, and her love for Harold now bore down on her like a crushing tide, leaving her feeling utterly alone. The legal battle that lay ahead felt daunting, but in her heart, she knew she had to fight for her truth. Little did she know, the trial would not only challenge her freedom but also force her to confront the deepest parts of herself and the love she had lost. The days following Margaret's arrest blurred together in a haze of anxiety and despair. News of Harold's murder spread like wildfire, saturating the airwaves and social media feeds with sensational headlines that painted her as a monster. The small town of Maplewood, once a serene backdrop for their love story, had become a battleground of public opinion. Margaret, trapped within the cold confines of her jail cell, felt the weight of judgment bearing down on her. The walls closed in as she contemplated the enormity of the situation, the loss of her love, the betrayal, and now the fight for her very freedom. In the early days of her incarceration, Margaret received little more than glimpses of humanity through the barred window of her cell. Visits from her mother, Amelia, became a lifeline in the darkness, though even those were tinged with uncertainty. Amelia struggled to reconcile her daughter's past with the allegations against her. "Margaret, I know this isn't who you are," she urged during their visits, her voice trembling. "But we need to prepare for the trial. You need a strong defense." The thought of standing trial terrified Margaret. How could she possibly convey the complexity of her relationship with Harold, the depths of her love, and the pain of his betrayal? How could she explain the moments leading to his death, the turmoil that had engulfed her that night? As she contemplated these questions, her mind wandered to the memories of their time together, the laughter, the joy, the dreams they had shared. They had planned a life together, and now, that life lay in ruins, replaced by the cold reality of a murder charge. As the trial date approached, Margaret's legal team began to assemble. They included a seasoned defense attorney, Clara Johnson, known for her fierce advocacy and ability to navigate complex cases. Clara was determined to reveal the truth behind Harold's murder and to challenge the narrative that painted Margaret as a calculated killer. She met with Margaret frequently, listening to her recount the events leading up to the fateful night. "Margaret, we need to focus on how this all began," Clara said during one of their sessions. "We'll need to establish that your actions were driven by a deep emotional response to the trauma of public humiliation and the fear of losing everything you had built with Harold." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with the truth of it. But as she spoke, Clara gently urged her to explore the darker corners of her memories. "Tell me about Harold's revelation at the reception. What led to that moment? What was your state of mind?" Clara's questions forced Margaret to confront the raw emotions that had spiraled out of control that night. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers and reporters eager to capture the latest developments in the high-profile case. As Margaret entered, she felt a mix of dread and determination. The courtroom, with its imposing walls and stern judge, felt alien to her, yet she knew this was where she would finally have the opportunity to tell her side of the story. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting its case, focusing on the events of the wedding day and portraying Margaret as a woman scorned, who had resorted to violence out of jealousy and anger. The prosecutor laid out the timeline: the public humiliation, the flight from the reception, and the subsequent discovery of Harold's body. Each point felt like a stab to Margaret's heart, the narrative skewed and devoid of context. Witness after witness took the stand, describing Harold's outburst and the horror that ensued. Detective Tremblay testified about the evidence collected at the scene, highlighting the defensive wounds found on Harold's body, suggesting a violent confrontation. The prosecution implied that Margaret had acted with premeditation, having fled the scene after committing the act, which left the jury grappling with the weight of the allegations. As the prosecution rested its case, Clara prepared to present Margaret's defense. She began by painting a picture of the couple's relationship, delving into the complexities that had defined their love. "Margaret O'Brien is not a killer," Clara asserted, her voice steady and unwavering. "She is a woman who fell deeply in love and who, on one fateful night, found herself in an impossible situation." Clara called Margaret to the stand, urging her to recount the events of that night from her perspective. "Margaret, please tell the court what you felt when Harold made that revelation," Clara prompted. The room fell silent as Margaret took a deep breath, her heart racing. "I felt exposed, humiliated," she began, her voice trembling. "I had loved Harold with everything I had, but in that moment, I felt like he had stripped away my dignity in front of everyone. I was terrified that he would leave me, that I would lose everything I had built with him." Tears filled her eyes as she continued, "I didn't want to hide who I was, but I had been so afraid of the world knowing my past. I thought that with Harold, I could finally be free. But when he humiliated me like that, it felt like everything was crashing down. The jury listened intently as Margaret shared her truth, the emotional weight of her words hanging in the air. She explained how she had fled the reception, needing to escape the pain and chaos that had erupted. "I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to get away. I didn't know Harold was following me," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Clara then presented evidence to support Margaret's claims, including testimony from Amelia, who spoke about her daughter's struggles and the advice she had given regarding her identity. "I just wanted to protect her," Amelia said, her voice filled with anguish. "I didn't want her to face discrimination, and I never imagined it would come to this." As the trial progressed, another pivotal moment arose when Clara called Kimberly Evans to the stand. The atmosphere shifted as Kimberly was questioned about her relationship with Harold and the suspicions she had harbored about Margaret. "I didn't trust Margaret," Kimberly admitted, her voice wavering. "I thought she was deceiving him." Clara pressed her for more details, unveiling the emotional turmoil that had existed beneath the surface of the family dynamics. "Did you ever discuss your suspicions with Harold?" Clara asked pointedly. Kimberly hesitated before responding, her expression revealing the conflicting emotions within her. "I did," she finally confessed. "I thought Harold deserved to know the truth. I wanted him to be careful." The revelation of Kimberly's involvement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. It painted a different picture of Harold's mindset leading up to the wedding day, suggesting that the seeds of doubt had been sown long before the ceremony. Clara seized the opportunity to illustrate the web of emotional turmoil that surrounded Harold and Margaret's relationship. After several tense days of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. Clara delivered a powerful closing argument, urging the jury to consider the emotional weight that Margaret had borne throughout her life and the trauma of the events that had unfolded. "Margaret O'Brien is a survivor," she proclaimed. "She did not choose this path, she was thrust into a nightmare. What happened that night was not premeditated, it was a reaction to a moment of overwhelming pain and humiliation." As the jury deliberated, Margaret sat in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The outcome felt uncertain, and the fear of what lay ahead loomed heavily over her. Would they see her truth? Would they understand the depth of her love for Harold and the pain of his betrayal? Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell silent. The judge asked for the verdict, and Margaret's breath hitched in her throat. "We find the defendant, Margaret O'Brien, guilty of second-degree murder," the foreman announced, and the words echoed in her mind like a death knell. The world around her faded as she processed the verdict. A mixture of despair and disbelief washed over her, and she felt the weight of her conviction crash down upon her. She had fought to prove her innocence, to reveal the complexities of her identity and her love for Harold, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. As the gavel struck, sealing her fate, Margaret realized that her journey was far from over. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison, a punishment that felt both a relief and a torment. The courtroom erupted into chaos as family members and supporters reacted to the verdict, some in tears while others remained silent, grappling with the enormity of the situation. As she was led away, Margaret cast one last look at her mother, who sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Amelia had fought so hard to protect her, to understand her, and now, the weight of the verdict felt like a shackle binding them both. The pain of her loss, the loss of Harold, the loss of her future, became an anchor in her heart as she stepped into the unknown, facing the reality of her sentence. In the months that followed, Margaret's life would change irrevocably. She would confront the shadows of her past, navigating the complexities of her identity while serving her time. The love she had shared with Harold would always remain a bittersweet memory, a reminder of the fragility of life and the unexpected twists that can alter its course forever. As she settled into her new reality, Margaret found solace in her own strength, determined to emerge from the shadows of her past and reclaim her identity. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she knew that she would fight for her truth, for the memory of the love that had once filled her life with light, even in the darkest of moments. The echoes of that wedding day, once filled with hope, would now serve as a catalyst for transformation, propelling her toward a future where she could finally be free.